What would have happened if Marilyn Monroe had lived? Marilyn Monroe was an actress of the Golden Age contracted to 20th Century Fox. She was a kind of Jean Harlow for the 1950s. She wasn't just a blonde, she was the blonde of the 50s, hence the title of the upcoming film. She first got noticed in All About Eve, playing a character that she would play in many of her most popular films, the naive but savvy blonde bombshell. Her most famous films include Some Like It Hot, The 7-Year Itch, and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. She was a talented comedic actress who broke away to study at the Actors Studio in New York and headed her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, making two of her most interesting films, Bus Stop and The Prince and the Showgirl, both of which allowed her to stretch her dramatic acting abilities. She passed away in the early 1960s, having completed one film, The Misfits, which was written for her by her third husband, esteemed playwright Arthur Miller, and co-starred heavy hitters such as Clark Gable, Montgomery Clift, and reunited her with her All About Eve co-star Thelma Ritter. This film was a very meta, postmodern look at the Western genre and Marilyn Monroe herself. It is probably her finest dramatic performance and introduces the long, straight hair look that would become prominent in the 1960s. It met with mixed reviews at the time, but has since been reassessed as a classic. Her next film, Something's Gotta Give, returns her to comedy with Dean Martin co-starring. She was the first actress to go nude for a major feature film, and this was chronicled in Life magazine, which Jane Mansfield soon copied. She was also speaking in her natural voice for the first time, so you could say that she did have her finger on the zeitgeist and was preparing to pivot, like her contemporary Elizabeth Taylor did to much success. If she had been able to complete the film, I imagine it would have been a big hit, as it had been for Doris Day when it was eventually made under a different title. The 1960s was a difficult time for the stars of the 50s. Elizabeth Taylor and Shelley Winters made the transition successfully, but many others did not. Jane Mansfield started taking on smaller and smaller movies and did anything she could for publicity, including meeting Anton LaVey, and eventually took her Las Vegas show on the road, which is where she met her untimely end. Mae West and Debbie Reynolds also had their Vegas acts. Eartha Kitt got married and had a child, and continued to perform her cabaret act around the world before getting into television with Catwoman, and then getting into trouble with the government when she opposed the Vietnam War. Dorothy Dandridge unfortunately also met an untimely end before she could make a comeback film herself. Some ground rules before I proceed to her slated projects for the 60s and potential future career. We all know that Marilyn struggled with mental health issues and had her addictions. I imagine these would have derailed her career had she lived. Had this happened, I do imagine that she most likely would have gone to Vegas and then come back later to do some of the all-star films of the 70s, like the Agatha Christie films or the disaster films like The Towering Inferno. Then done some of the all-star soaps and miniseries of the 80s, like Elizabeth Taylor and Barbara Stanwyck did. She was not as friendless as it seemed. Her former roommate, Oscar nominee Shelley Winters, often said it was a pity that Marilyn and she couldn't have grown old and fat together. So this is what I want to explore. To do this, we have to imagine that she was able to find a good doctor and get her mental health stabilized, and that she had found a loving, supportive husband. Successful people often have a great support system around them, and I don't think Marilyn really ever did. Let's look at what she was planning to do. Now, her friend Truman Capote had written Breakfast at Tiffany's about Marilyn, and had she played the role, it would have continued the Misfits' look into examining her 1950s blonde bombshell image. Ultimately, the studio didn't want Marilyn because she wasn't very reliable at the time, and the studio wanted to move in the direction of something a little bit safer like Audrey Hepburn. But I can see Marilyn giving the role and Moon River her all if Truman Capote had his way. She was in talks with NBC to do a television film, Rain. This film had previously been made 3 times, twice by Gloria Swanson and once by Joan Crawford, who, rumor would have it, was an intimate friend of Marilyn's. The story was about a good time gal, the flapper, who goes to the jungle with a missionary who is so overcome with her sensuality that he forces himself onto her. It's certainly not a story that has aged well, but I can see why Marilyn would have wanted to play the part. It was perfect for her. And I probably would have put Anthony Perkins against her, who would have been fresh off Psycho, into the role of the missionary, which, again, it could have earned her an Emmy or something like that. Like, I could see her being able to get her teeth into a role like this. Had Marilyn done television, this might have meant Jane Mansfield, who copied everything Marilyn did, would have accepted the role on Gilligan's Island in 1964 and reignited her career, thus keeping her off the road and perhaps back into the arms of her second husband, the one who loved her. But I digress. She had also signed, she being Marilyn, had signed a contract to star in the biopic of Jean Harlow, which is simply perfect casting. Marilyn had admired Jean Harlow herself, but she apparently wasn't happy with the script, saying, "I hope they don't do that to me after I'm gone." I'll let you decide if indeed they did do that to her after she passed. Well, but with the right script and director, she may have been nominated for an Oscar. We know the Academy loves films about Hollywood. So with the right script and director, she may have been even nominated for an Oscar, perhaps even the same year as her co-star Bette Davis from All About Eve in 1963. However, with her All About Eve director busy reworking Cleopatra for Elizabeth Taylor, perhaps she would have once again turned to Arthur Miller or Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett to rework the script and make it something that she would have wanted to have done. Next up, the film that was ultimately a Shirley MacLaine movie, What a Way to Go, was originally being developed for Marilyn, which would have paired her up again with Dean Martin and put her back into comedy as the gold digger, just like in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, as the film is about a 4-time widow whose husbands all died in their drive to be rich. A kind of, material girl type of film. It was an all-star cast, which included Paul Newman as the taxi driver in Paris, Gene Kelly, Robert Mitchum, and more. I think this would have been a smash hit for her, as it was for Shirley MacLaine. Lastly, the Joanne Woodward film The Stripper was being developed for Marilyn, where an aging, down-on-her-luck stripper moves in with her neighbours and attempts to lead a normal life. However, falls in love with the son of the neighbour. So it does remind me a little bit of her role in Bus Stop, but I think this could have been an interesting film for her as well. So her 60s career did seem to be heading into a mix of comedies and dramas with potential for being well noticed by the Academy. Now, the issue then becomes how she might have handled turning 40, which she would have done in 1966. Even today, many female stars find themselves left out in the cold by an unfeeling Hollywood once they hit the big 4-0. Would she have gone into the hagsploitation horror films that a number of her contemporaries did? Perhaps Berserk with Joan Crawford in the Diana Dawes role? Or would she have continued to do more comedies? Maybe her and Dean Martin would have made a nice duo, and perhaps she would have even been in some of those films, like the roast. Could you imagine a roast of Marilyn Monroe? And yeah, so they could have been a nice duo and done films like Rock Hudson and Doris Day had done. Now, I do have a feeling she may have followed in her friend Eartha Kitt's footsteps and gotten married and had a child. It did seem towards the end of her life like she was rekindling something with Joe DiMaggio, so that might have been something that had happened. And once her priorities had likely changed, I imagined that her old friend Shelley Winters would have perhaps recommended donning her glasses and doing more character roles where she wasn't the main star. And she may have been happier that way. I don't see her stepping away from the limelight the way Doris Day did, as she went to the actor's studio and was serious about her craft. I do think she would have likely have done a Vegas act during the lulls, like Jane Mansfield, Mae West, and obviously Eartha Kitt did. And I can see her doing guest spots in Bewitched and Here's Lucy as well. Perhaps she would have done Catwoman, although she doesn't seem too much like Julie Newmar. I can see, I'm not sure if I can see her in Batman. So this is where I look to the careers of another of her imitators, Diana Dawes, for guidance, who did a mixture of films and miniseries on TV. And I think these films would have mostly been the ensemble casts of the 70s and 80s. I can definitely see her in the Kim Novak role in The Mirror Cracked, or in Evil Under the Sun as James Mason's wife, or perhaps the Diana Rigg role. I'm sure she would have done well in miniseries like The Martian Chronicles with Rock Hudson. I could also see her following in Elizabeth Taylor's footsteps and releasing a perfume, and like Jennifer Jones, become an advocate for mental illness. Perhaps this might have been her greatest legacy, the way Elizabeth Taylor's greatest legacy was her advocacy during the AIDS crisis. And now I feel sad. She's remembered as being the epitome of a movie star, but had she lived, I believed she would have been much more than that. And I believe the world would have been a better place for it. Thank you for listening or watching on YouTube. Please let me know whose careers you'd like me to explore. I'm already working on scripts for ones about James Dean, River Phoenix, and Jean Harlow, but there are many stars whose careers have been cut short. Please leave your ideas in the comments, and see you next time.